It started the night I moved into my new apartment. I had just graduated college and landed my first real job in a mid-sized American city. After months of living with roommates and dealing with noisy neighbors, the idea of having a space all to myself was intoxicating. The apartment was small, a one-bedroom unit on the second floor of a brick building constructed in the late 1950s. It had a little balcony, creaking floors, and a musty smell that screamed old, but it was mine. I loved it immediately. The quiet and isolation a welcome change from the chaos of dorm life. The first night, I unpacked a few boxes and set up my mattress on the floor since my furniture hadn't arrived yet. I turned on the small lamp by the bed, adjusted the blinds, and lay down, feeling the stillness settle around me. Outside, the street was nearly empty, and I could hear only the occasional hum of a car or the distant barking of a dog. I felt safe, or at least I thought I did. Around 2:30 a.m., I woke. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the windows, but then I heard it again, a soft scraping, like someone dragging a finger along the wall in the living room. My pulse jumped, and I froze, holding my breath. I told myself it was the building settling, or perhaps my imagination. The sound stopped as suddenly as it began. Eventually, I managed to convince myself that I was just tired and let sleep take me again, though it was light, uneasy sleep. The next day, I tried to push the thought aside. I busied myself with unpacking, making coffee, and familiarizing myself with the small city neighborhood. Nothing out of the ordinary happened during the day, but when night fell, the unease returned. That night, it started again, and this time it wasn't just scraping. It was tapping. Slow, deliberate taps at the kitchen window. I lay in bed, heart hammering, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Tap, tap, tap. Each one precise, deliberate, too steady to be the wind or a branch. I eventually got out of bed, barefoot on the cold floor, clutching a baseball bat I had grabbed from a box. I crept to the kitchen window. Nothing. The street was empty. The trees didn't move. There was no sound other than the faint hum of the refrigerator. My chest heaved, adrenaline coursing through me. I backed away slowly, returned to bed, and tried to sleep again, but the tension lingered, making it impossible to relax. The next few nights followed a pattern. Tapping at windows, soft whispers I couldn't make out, objects slightly shifted when I returned to a room. At first, it was small things, my keys, my coffee mug, even the corner of my bed cover moved slightly. I tried rationalizing it. Maybe I was absent-mindedly moving things while half asleep, or my cat was knocking things over. But the feeling of being watched persisted, heavier each night. By the third week, it escalated. I woke one night to the sound of breathing just outside my bedroom door. Slow, deliberate, almost synchronized with my own heartbeat. I froze, clutching the bat, and listened. The breathing stopped suddenly, leaving a heavy, oppressive silence. My cat hissed, crouched at the foot of the bed, had fur standing on end. I stayed motionless, willing the presence to leave. It didn't, at least not immediately. Eventually, I fell into an uneasy, fragmented sleep. Over the next few months, the experiences intensified. The whispering became clearer, often repeating my name, sometimes fragmented sentences. Wait, here, soon. Objects moved more obviously. A plate that I left in the kitchen would be on the floor in the middle of the living room. My keys would appear on the windowsill. Stones, small, smooth river stones, started appearing in odd places, on my nightstand, in the hallway, even on my balcony. Sometimes they had words scratched into them. Wait, sleep, come. I installed cameras, hoping for some logical explanation. The footage never showed anything unusual. The recordings captured the sound, the taps, the whispers, the footsteps, but never revealed the source. I began sleeping with the lights on, bat under the pillow, phone at hand. Still, the presence made itself known. I stopped leaving my apartment except for work. I stopped answering calls from friends. I tried medication, therapy, everything I could think of to cope, but the experiences followed me. The whispers were sometimes faint, sometimes loud enough to make me flinch, always just out of sight, always at the edge of perception. One night, desperate for proof, I set up a recorder and went to bed. At exactly 3:14 a.m., the tapping began. Tap, tap, tap. I held my breath. Then came the whispers. Faint at first, almost inaudible, then growing clearer. My name, my full name. I sat upright, frozen, the hair on my arms standing. Footsteps echoed across the apartment, stopping just short of my bedroom door. I eventually fled that apartment, moving back in with my parents temporarily. Even there, in a place I thought was safe, I could feel it, always just outside my awareness, waiting. The whispering continued, faint but unmistakable. The shadows returned, flickering at the edge of my vision. It became clear whatever this was, it didn't care about walls or distance. Over the next few years, I moved several times, thinking that distance might help. But it didn't. Every new place, the whispering returned. The tapping, the shadows, always waiting, always patient. Some nights I wake in the middle of the night, certain I feel a presence leaning close, whispering my name. Sometimes I see a shadow just out of the corner of my eye, tall, thin, featureless, lingering where no one should be. I've learned to live with it, to exist in a state of constant vigilance. I leave lights on, I sleep with my phone recording. I never leave a room completely dark. I check locks multiple times. I tell myself that ignoring it makes it stronger, that acknowledging its presence is the only way to survive the night. But the truth is, I don't know what it is, and I don't know when it will reach for me fully. Some nights, I lie awake for hours, listening to the faint hum of the city outside, the occasional creak of my home, and I can hear it. The soft whispering, the taps, the shifting of things just beyond my vision. I know it is patient. It has been following me for years, and it will continue to follow me. It waits for the moment I let my guard down, the moment I close my eyes, thinking I am safe. That moment will come, and when it does, I know I won't be able to escape. The house, or apartment, or hotel, or any place I try to make my own never feels empty, never safe. I have learned to live in this constant tension, always listening, always watching. And yet, despite everything, sleep eventually overtakes me. But even then, in dreams, I can feel it. The whispering, the tapping, the presence waiting, knowing, patient. I do not know if I will ever be free. I do not know if anyone ever has been free. I only know that the fear, the waiting, the presence, it will always be there, watching, patient and relentless. And when I finally fall completely asleep, I know it will be there, closer than I can imagine, ready to remind me that I am never truly alone. Story, the end. It was already past midnight when Claire realized her apartment had gone too quiet. She'd been lying in bed, tossing from one side to the other, staring at the ceiling as the hum of the city outside faded into the kind of silence that never felt natural in downtown Boston. Normally, there were car horns, music spilling from some bar down the block, or her upstairs neighbor stomping around like he was training for a marathon. But tonight, there was nothing. No noise, no movement, just an oppressive stillness that made the hairs on her arms rise. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, the bright glow stabbing at her eyes as she checked the time. 12:41 a.m. Her apartment was dark except for the faint yellow streetlight filtering through the blinds, painting stripes across the bedroom wall. She told herself she was just restless, maybe over-caffeinated from that extra cup of coffee during her late shift at the diner, but that didn't explain why her heart felt like it was beating too hard against her ribs. Rolling onto her back, she tried to listen for something, anything, to break the silence. That's when she heard it. A faint creak from the living room. It was so soft she almost convinced herself it was the building settling. Old buildings made noises all the time, especially this one with its warped wood and ancient pipes. She closed her eyes, telling herself that's all it was, but then there it was again. A slow, deliberate groan of a floorboard shifting under weight, closer this time. Claire sat up, her throat tightening. She glanced toward her bedroom door, which was cracked open just enough to reveal the sliver of dim light from the living room. Her first instinct was to grab her phone, dial 911, and let the cops sort out whatever was going on. But she hesitated. She hadn't locked the door after getting home. She never did. The building had an entry buzzer and 2 deadbolts on the main entrance. No one just walked in. Besides, she didn't hear the front door open. Her bare feet met the cool hardwood as she slipped out of bed, phone in hand, screen still glowing faint blue. She muted it out of habit. Why, she didn't know, then crept to the door. Every step she took seemed impossibly loud, like the sound was amplified in the stillness. When she reached the doorframe, she paused, listening again. Nothing. She leaned forward, peering into the living room. The couch sat where it always was, a thrift store find draped in an old quilt. The tiny kitchen beyond was as quiet as ever, the clock on the wall frozen at 12:43. She exhaled slowly, almost laughing at herself. "You're being ridiculous," she whispered under her breath, stepping forward. Then she noticed the blinds. They were open. Not all the way, but just enough that a sliver of the street below was visible through the narrow gap. She never left the blinds open. Ever. Claire's throat went dry. She was certain she'd closed them before going to bed, just like she always did, tugging the cord until the slats clapped shut. She told herself maybe she'd been distracted, maybe she'd forgotten, but the uneasy prickle in her gut refused to settle. A soft knock shattered the silence. She froze, every muscle in her body tensing. The knock wasn't at her door. It was on the window. Her eyes darted toward the sound, toward the blinds now slightly parted, and for a split second she thought she saw something. Movement, a faint shape shifting just beyond the glass. Her heart stuttered. She lived on the 4th floor. There was no ledge, no balcony, no way anyone could be standing outside her window unless they were. The knock came again, louder this time, sharper, deliberate. Claire stumbled backward, her phone slipping in her sweaty palm as she fumbled to dial 911. Her thumb hovered over the call button, but before she could press it, the apartment plunged into darkness. The power cut out so abruptly, it was as though the world blinked off. Her phone screen died too, as if drained. The silence that followed was suffocating. Her breathing grew shallow as her eyes adjusted. The faint glow of the city, the only thing illuminating the edges of her furniture. She could feel it. The presence of something in the room with her, not just outside, but here, inside, waiting. She backed toward her bedroom, step by slow step, her bare feet brushing against the cool wood floor, praying she wouldn't trip over anything. The air had changed. It was heavier, colder, thick with that unexplainable static that makes every instinct in your body scream to run. Then, from the corner of the room near the kitchen, she heard it. A breath. Not hers. Low, ragged, almost wet, as though someone was standing just out of sight, struggling to breathe quietly but failing. Claire's chest constricted and she bolted for her bedroom, slamming the door shut behind her, twisting the tiny lock into place. She pressed her back against the wood, straining to hear. For a moment, there was nothing but her own racing pulse pounding in her ears. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, dragging across the floor. One step, pause, another. She clamped a hand over her mouth, muffling the ragged gasps threatening to give her away. Her phone, dead and useless in her trembling hand, reflected the faintest trace of her pale face. The footsteps stopped outside her bedroom door. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Then from the other side, a whisper. Claire. Her knees almost buckled. She didn't recognize the voice. Deep, hoarse, and impossibly close. Whoever, whatever, was out there knew her name. The handle rattled softly as though someone was testing it, then stopped. The quiet stretched on, every second dragging like an eternity until the oppressive stillness returned, and she thought, hoped it was gone. But then she heard the scrape of something being dragged across the living room floor. A chair, or maybe the coffee table. Her mind spun, searching for explanations, for logic, but nothing fit. There was no way anyone could have gotten in without her hearing the front door. There was no way they could have been outside her window. And yet someone, or something, was in her apartment, moving through the darkness like it belonged there. Claire backed away from the door until her legs hit the bed, collapsing onto it silently. She curled herself into the smallest ball she could, eyes fixed on the thin line of light seeping in from under the door, waiting for the inevitable shadow to pass across it. It never did. Minutes, hours maybe, dragged by in tense silence until, at some point, exhaustion overtook her. When she woke, sunlight was streaming through the cracks in the blinds, painting the room in soft gold. The power was back. Her phone lay on the floor beside the bed, the screen cracked but glowing again. She sat up slowly, every muscle stiff, her throat raw from breathing shallow all night. For a long moment, she didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even breathe. Then, finally, she stood, cracked the door open, and peered into the living room. Everything looked normal. The couch, the coffee table, the blinds now completely shut. It was as though nothing had happened, except for one thing. On the floor, in the middle of the living room, was her dining chair, dragged from the kitchen and turned to face her bedroom door. Story the end. It started with the kind of quiet that doesn't feel right, the kind that seeps under your skin and makes you check the locks twice. I had moved into the little two-bedroom house in early October, just outside a small town in northern Pennsylvania. The rent was cheap, too cheap if I'm being honest, but I'd been desperate to get out of my apartment after the lease ended, and the listing had popped up at the perfect time. The landlord, a man named James, had been quick to approve my application. "You'll like it out here," he'd said on the phone, his voice tinny and oddly muffled. "Nice and quiet. Perfect for someone like you." I hadn't asked what he meant by that, but when I pulled up in my old Honda Civic and saw the house, a squat white structure with dark green shutters surrounded by skeletal trees, I understood. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes from being just far enough from town that you don't hear cars or kids playing or neighbors yelling through thin walls. Just the wind and sometimes the sound of something scurrying through the leaves. The first night passed uneventfully. I unpacked just enough to sleep. Mattress on the floor, a single blanket, phone charging by the outlet. I'd been too tired to even bother with curtains, so the moonlight streamed in through the bare window as I drifted off. But sometime around 3 a.m., I woke up. I didn't know why at first. There was no sound, no obvious reason. Just me, blinking in the darkness, staring at the faint glow of the trees outside my window. Then, faintly, I thought I heard something. A creak. Slow, deliberate, like someone stepping on the warped floorboards near the front of the house. I held my breath, straining to hear it again, but the house was still. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just settling noises. The kind of thing old houses do, right? I closed my eyes and tried to sleep. The second night, I made sure to close the bedroom door before lying down. I wasn't scared, exactly, but the quiet still felt heavy. I had a lamp on the floor next to my mattress, casting a weak yellow light against the peeling paint of the walls. Sleep came in fits. I kept waking up, sometimes to the sound of wind rattling branches against the siding, other times to nothing at all. Then, around 2:45, I heard it again. Creak. But this time, it was closer. My bedroom door was closed, but the sound had a direction, like it was right outside in the hallway. Slow, dragging footsteps on the wood floor. I sat up in bed, my heart thudding in my ears, and stared at the door. No shadows moved beneath it, no handles turned. After what felt like forever, I worked up the nerve to stand and open the door. The hallway was empty, the front of the house dark except for the faint spill of moonlight through the living room window. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself, but my voice sounded too loud, too sharp in the silence. By the third night, I started locking the bedroom door. It didn't help. I woke up around the same time, my phone screen glowing 3:03 a.m., and there was no mistaking it this time. Someone or something was moving around in the house. Slow steps, one after another, pacing from the front door to the kitchen, then stopping in the hallway outside my room. The wood groaned under the weight. I sat up in bed, every muscle in my body tensed, staring at the thin strip of light spilling through the gap at the bottom of the door. And then, as if sensing I was awake, the footsteps stopped. For a full 5 minutes, there was nothing but silence. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then came a sound I will never forget, a soft, deliberate scrape, nails or fingers dragging slowly down the length of my bedroom door. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I clutched my phone in a death grip, my thumb hovering over the call button, but I couldn't bring myself to make a sound. And then, just as suddenly, the scraping stopped. The rest of the night passed without another sound, but I didn't sleep. By morning, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an animal, raccoon, stray cat, something like that. Old houses made weird noises. I told myself a dozen reasons why it wasn't something to be scared of, but none of them made sense when I realized there were no marks on the door, not even a smudge. I thought about calling the landlord, but what would I even say? "Hey, I think something's walking around your rental at night." He'd laugh, or worse, think I was crazy. So I bought a cheap set of motion sensors from the hardware store in town. Little white plastic boxes that chirped when something moved past them. I put one by the front door, one in the kitchen, and one just outside my bedroom. That night, I went to bed early, every light in the house blazing, my phone clutched in my hand. At 2:57 a.m., the sensor outside my bedroom chirped. I froze, staring at the shadowed gap under the door. The chirp meant something was moving out there, something big enough to trip the sensor. Then came the footsteps, slow, careful, right up to my door. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but sit there and listen, but my body wouldn't move. The handle rattled softly, once, twice, like someone testing it, and then in a voice so soft I almost thought I imagined it, came a whisper. "Why did you lock it?" I don't remember falling asleep. I must have passed out from sheer exhaustion or terror, because when I woke, it was morning, sunlight streaming through the window like none of it had happened. I didn't stay in the house that night. I drove into town, parked at the 24-hour diner, and sat there nursing bad coffee until the sun came up. When I got back, everything was exactly how I'd left it. No signs of a break-in, no footprints, nothing. But the feeling in the house had changed. It was heavier, like the walls were pressing in, like whatever had been pacing at night was waiting for me to come back. I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was being paranoid, but every night the noises got worse. Scratching at the walls, footsteps that moved from room to room, always stopping just outside my bedroom. Sometimes I'd hear whispering, low, urgent, words I couldn't quite make out, except for my name, repeated over and over. By the end of the first week, I stopped locking the door. It didn't make a difference, and the thing, whatever it was, seemed to like it better when it was open. One night, I woke to the sound of breathing, not mine. Deep, ragged breaths coming from the corner of the room. I turned my head slowly, afraid of what I'd see, and in the faint moonlight, I thought I saw the outline of something crouched by the wall. It didn't move. Neither did I. When I finally blinked, the corner was empty. I don't remember much after that, not in clear details. Nights blurred together. Whispers, footsteps, the creak of the floorboards under invisible weight. My phone stopped holding a charge, like something in the house drained it. The sensors stopped chirping. I thought about leaving. God, I wanted to leave. But every time I packed a bag, something stopped me. The air would grow thick, heavy, and I'd hear my name whispered, soft and coaxing, from somewhere in the house. "Stay," it would say. And I did. Until last night. I don't know what changed. Maybe it got tired of waiting. Maybe it had been planning this from the start. All I know is I woke up to find the bedroom door wide open, every light in the house off, and the smell of earth, wet, rotting earth, filling the air. The footsteps weren't careful anymore. They pounded through the house, fast, urgent, until they stopped right at the foot of my bed. I didn't move. I couldn't. And then, in the darkness, it leaned close enough that I felt its breath against my ear and whispered, "You should never have come here." Story the end. The first time I noticed something was wrong, it was subtle, barely enough to raise concern. I had just moved into a one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of a quiet town in Ohio. Rent was cheap, almost suspiciously cheap, but the landlord told me the usual story about needing to fill vacancies fast, and I didn't question it. The building was old, probably from the late 50s, with warped wooden floors that creaked when you walked too quickly, and radiators that hissed like angry cats when the heat came on. I remember telling myself it had character, even when I felt that inexplicable unease that settled in every night after dark. The first night, I fell asleep easily, the kind of exhaustion that comes from moving boxes up 2 flights of stairs alone. Around 3 a.m., I woke up for no reason, the room unnaturally still. My clock was ticking, my little fan buzzing softly, but something felt off. It was the silence beyond those small noises that unsettled me, as though the world outside my window was holding its breath. I brushed it off as nerves and went back to sleep. But the next morning, when I went to make coffee, I noticed the window over my sink was unlocked. I never touched it. The latch was rusty, hard to move, but it sat there halfway open like someone had forced it up in the night. I told myself I must have forgotten, that maybe the landlord had left it open during maintenance, but deep down it left a sour taste in my mouth. I locked it tight, checked the others, and told myself I'd be more careful. By the end of my first week, the noises started. Faint footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment late at night, long after my neighbors had gone quiet. Slow, dragging steps that moved from one end of the hall to the other and then stopped. Sometimes I'd hear a soft tap on my door, so faint I almost convinced myself it was the building settling. Once I worked up the courage to check, yanking the door open mid-step, but the hallway was empty, just the buzzing fluorescent light casting sickly yellow shadows down the peeling walls. I started double locking my door after that. Then came the dreams. They were vivid, disjointed flashes that made no sense but left me waking up drenched in sweat. A dark figure at the end of my bed, just out of reach. The sound of someone whispering my name from the corner of my room. The sensation of fingers brushing against my ankle while I lay frozen in place. Every time I woke up gasping, my eyes darting to the shadows, expecting someone to be there. Nothing ever was. By the second month, I started noticing other things, small but undeniable. My keys moved from the kitchen counter to the coffee table while I was in the shower. My phone, always plugged in by my bed, ended up across the room on the windowsill. And then there were the sticky notes. The first one appeared one Thursday evening, stuck to my bathroom mirror. In messy, almost childlike handwriting, it said, "I can see you." I froze when I saw it, my hand shaking as I peeled it off the glass. I convinced myself it had to be some cruel prank, maybe a neighbor who had gotten in somehow, though the locks were untouched. I even called the landlord, who swore no one else had keys. I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I knew better. A few days later, another note appeared, this time on the fridge. "Stop looking." I barely slept after that. Every creak in the building set my nerves on edge. I started sleeping with my phone clutched in my hand, ready to call 911 if I heard anything. But nothing ever escalated, not until that stormy night in October. I'd been lying in bed, scrolling aimlessly on my phone like rain tapping against the windows. Thunder rolled in the distance, muffled but constant. Around midnight, the power went out, plunging the apartment into darkness. I grabbed a flashlight, its beam slicing through the shadows, and sat there on the edge of the bed, telling myself it was just the weather. But then I heard it, those slow, deliberate footsteps in the hall. Closer this time, stopping right outside my door. I held my breath, my flashlight trained on the thin line of light at the bottom of the door. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, ever so slowly, the doorknob turned. Not all the way, just enough to make a soft, metallic click. I didn't move, didn't even blink. Eventually, the knob stilled and the footsteps retreated down the hall until there was only silence again. I don't know how long I sat there, heart pounding, before I finally worked up the courage to check the door. Locked, deadbolt secure. But when I turned back toward the living room, my stomach dropped. There was a new sticky note on the coffee table, written in that same messy scrawl, "Almost." After that, everything spiraled. I stopped sleeping through the night entirely. Bags formed under my eyes, and I started missing work, too scared to leave my apartment unattended. I tried telling friends, but what could I say? That someone was breaking in just to leave notes and move things around? That I was hearing footsteps and whispers no one else could hear? They'd look at me with that pitying expression, the one that said they thought I was losing it. By November, I installed cameras. Cheap little motion detecting ones I found online. I placed one in the living room, one in the kitchen, and one pointed at the front door. The first night, nothing. The second night, nothing. On the third night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to that same stillness, the same heavy silence pressing against the walls. The next morning, when I checked the footage, my blood ran cold. At exactly 2:47 a.m., the camera in the living room flickered, just for a second. When the feed returned, there was someone standing there. A tall, thin silhouette, completely still, its head tilted slightly like it was listening. No face, no features, just an outline darker than the shadows around it. And then, without moving, it was gone, vanished between one frame and the next. I couldn't stay there after that. I packed a bag and went to stay with my sister an hour away. She thought I was overreacting until I showed her the footage. Even then, she tried to rationalize it. Glitchy camera, bad lighting, maybe a trick of the shadows, but I could see it in her eyes. She was scared too. I stayed with her for 2 weeks, trying to convince myself it had been some sort of breakdown, that maybe I just needed rest. When I finally worked up the nerve to go back, the apartment felt different, colder. The moment I stepped through the door, a chill ran up my spine like I just walked into someone else's space. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt it. The weight of something standing just beyond the edge of my vision, watching. I kept the lights on, every single one, until the sun came up, and that's when I found the last note taped to the inside of my bedroom door, written in that same messy scrawl. You can't leave. I moved out the next day. I didn't pack everything, didn't clean, didn't even leave a forwarding address. I just threw what I could into my car and drove until I hit the state line. But even now, months later, when I lie awake at night in my new place, I swear I can hear it sometimes. The slow, deliberate creak of footsteps outside my bedroom door, getting closer and closer and closer. Story the end. It started as an ordinary night. I had just moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of Cleveland, not too far from the highway, but far enough that the neighborhood felt quiet, almost unnervingly so. I had chosen it because of the low rent and the high ceilings, something I'd always wanted. The building itself was old, with that faint, persistent smell of mildew and wood polish that older buildings always seem to carry. I was alone. My roommate, if you could call it that, was just the idea of someone who might move in someday, but for now, it was just me and my half-unpacked boxes. The first week was uneventful, almost comforting. I liked the sound of the heater humming at night, the way the wind rattled the window frames, how shadows crept across the wooden floors. But on the 8th night, something shifted. It started with the sound of scratching. At first, I thought it was rats, which would not have surprised me. The building was old, after all. But the sound wasn't coming from the walls or the ceiling. It was coming from my bedroom door. Lightly at first, just enough that it made me pause while unpacking my clothes. Then, it got louder. Deliberate. I convinced myself it was the wind. My apartment was drafty, the kind where a poorly closed door could make all sorts of noises. I tried to go to sleep anyway. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. The scratching stopped. My heart slowed. Relief. Then came the breathing, soft, measured, almost human. Not the kind of panting or wheezing that belongs to someone exerting themselves, but slow, deliberate breaths. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, but the shadows near my door began to stretch, elongating in the weak light of the street lamps outside my window. They moved in a way shadows shouldn't move, almost as if something or someone was standing just beyond the door. I sat up, straining to see. Nothing. I shook my head and muttered, "Get a grip, idiot. You're alone." But the scratching started again. This time it was accompanied by a whisper. I couldn't make out the words at first, just soft murmurs, like someone talking to themselves. I got out of bed and tiptoed to the door, pressing my ear against it. The murmuring stopped immediately. I turned the handle slowly. The hallway was empty, dead silent, except for the faint hum of the heater from the living room. I breathed a little easier, told myself I must be tired, and returned to bed. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, everything seemed normal. No scratches, no whispers, just the faint smell of mildew and the sound of my neighbor's dog barking. I considered calling my landlord to ask about the history of the building, but I didn't want to seem crazy. I started unpacking again, trying to push the events of the previous night out of my mind. Then, the nights began to get worse. Not every night, but enough to make me dread going to bed. At first, it was small things. Doors that I was certain I had closed swinging open, the feeling of being watched in the kitchen while I cooked, shadows that seemed to linger longer than they should. Then I started hearing footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, pacing outside my bedroom door at 3, 4, sometimes 5 in the morning. I would hold my breath, convinced that if I moved, the footsteps would stop. And most nights, they did, right when I opened my eyes. I began to notice other things too. My belongings would be moved slightly, just enough that I'd notice the change. A coffee mug shifted an inch to the left, my laptop facing a slightly different direction. I told myself it was sleepwalking. I told myself a lot of things to avoid facing the truth, that someone was in my apartment, but deep down I knew. I wasn't imagining this. One night I decided to confront it. I bought a small flashlight, the kind you could carry in your pocket, and waited for the noises to start. I sat in my bed, listening as the scratching began, the whispers returned. The shadows stretched across my bedroom wall. I gripped the flashlight tightly, my palms sweaty. I waited. Then the footsteps came. Slow, deliberate, circling my room. My stomach churned. I whispered, "Who's there?" No answer. I mustered every ounce of courage I had and flicked on the flashlight. The beam cut across the room, landing on nothing. The shadows retreated to the corners. My bedroom door was still closed. I felt a chill run down my spine. The footsteps stopped. The whispers stopped. I lay back down, but sleep refused to come. The next day, I went to a hardware store and bought door locks, window latches, and even a small security camera. I installed them all, telling myself that if someone tried to enter, I would at least have evidence. The first night after the installation, I felt slightly safer. The scratching came again, of course, but this time I watched the camera feed. Nothing. The shadows still moved. The whispers still came. But no one was there. I started keeping a journal, documenting every sound, every movement, every strange occurrence. It became an obsession. I noticed patterns. The noises always started around 2:47 a.m., the same time each night. They always stopped just before dawn. I began to dread those hours more than anything else. One night, I decided to record the sounds. I set up my phone near the bed and went to sleep. When I woke up, I immediately grabbed the phone and played the recording. At first, it was just scratching and whispering. Then I noticed something, a low, guttural voice underneath the whispers. It was saying my name. Not once, not twice, but over and over again. My blood ran cold. I hadn't imagined it. Someone or something was calling me. I considered moving. I really did. But I had already signed the lease, paid the deposit, and moved all my belongings. I didn't have the energy to start over somewhere else. So I stayed, fortified my apartment as best I could, and endured the nights. Weeks passed. The sounds grew more confident, more assertive. I could hear footsteps pacing my living room when I was in the kitchen, scratching on the bathroom door when I was in the shower, whispers in the hallway when I was watching TV. One night I woke up to find my bedroom door wide open. I had locked it before bed. I froze. Then I saw it, a shadow at the end of the hall. Not just any shadow. This one had a shape, vaguely human but wrong, distorted. It didn't move like a person. It just stayed there, watching. I couldn't breathe. My hands shook as I reached for my phone to call the police, but the line was dead. I could hear the whispers now, closer, almost inside my head. I ran out of the apartment, down the stairs, into the lobby. Empty. I ran outside into the street, the cold night air burning my lungs. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I called 911. They sent an officer. He walked through my apartment, checked the locks, looked at the camera. Nothing, he said. All seems secure. Maybe a mouse? I didn't argue. I just went back inside, convinced I was losing my mind. That night, I decided to stay awake. I sat in my living room, lights on, doors locked, flashlight in hand. The hours dragged on. I dozed for a few minutes, just enough to feel the room tilt slightly. When I opened my eyes, I was not alone. The shadow was in my living room. It was closer this time, taller. I could feel its presence pressing down on me, cold and heavy. I screamed, swung the flashlight, and it vanished. Just like that. The next day, I found scratches on the walls, deep, long, as if something had dragged its claws along them. Not furniture, not rats. Something with intent. The nights continued. I never saw the shadow fully, always Glennavision. The whispers became more insistent, almost conversational. They knew my routines, my habits, my fears. It was like it had been living with me longer than I had been living there. One night, around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. I wasn't dreaming. I could feel it. The room was dark, but the shadows were moving. I pulled the blanket over my head, heart pounding, praying it would go away. Then I heard it, my name, clear as day, coming from the hallway. Daniel. I didn't answer. It came closer. The air grew thick, cold. I could hear it breathing, slow and deliberate, right outside my door. Then the whisper changed. Daniel, come with me. I stayed silent. It waited and waited. I don't know how long, hours, maybe minutes. Time was impossible to measure. When dawn finally broke, it left. The room felt lighter, warmer, but I knew it would return that night. I started keeping lights on all night. The whispers didn't stop, but they were less bold in the light. The shadows still lingered. I was exhausted, but I had to stay awake. I couldn't let it take me while I slept. Weeks turned into months. I developed routines, strategies. I slept during the day, stayed awake at night. I even started talking to it, whispering back, trying to negotiate, trying to keep it at bay. Sometimes it responded, sometimes it just listened. Then, one night, I noticed something new. My reflection in the bathroom mirror didn't move the way I did. Slightly behind, slightly off. I blinked. It mimicked me, but not perfectly. Its eyes weren't mine. They were dark, endless, like black pits. I screamed. The reflection smiled. I never slept again. Months later, friends came to visit. I showed them the apartment. They noticed the locks, the cameras, the strange modifications I had made. I told them the noises, the shadows, the whispers. They laughed, called me paranoid, called it stress, said I needed therapy. They stayed the night. None of them slept, not a single one. The scratching kept them awake. The whispers kept them awake. Some even claimed they saw shadows moving in the corners of their eyes. The next morning, they didn't come back. I was alone again, but I knew better now. It wasn't going anywhere. It was patient, eternal, waiting, watching, whispering. Some nights I still hear it. Even now I hear it calling my name. Sometimes it's faint, almost gentle. Other times it's loud, insistent, demanding, and I know it will never leave. I keep the lights on. I never sleep. I whisper back, and sometimes, just sometimes, I feel its eyes on me, waiting for me to close my eyes. But I never will. Story the end. It was late September when I moved into my new apartment in a quiet suburb of Pennsylvania. The place was affordable, not too far from work, and seemed perfect for someone like me, recently graduated, trying to start life on my own. The building was older, built sometime in the 1960s, but the landlord assured me that the plumbing had been updated and the wiring was safe. I signed the lease and moved in on a Friday afternoon, carrying boxes through the narrow hallway with the faint smell of damp carpet lingering in the air. The unit itself was small, a one-bedroom with a kitchenette and a living room that barely fit a couch and coffee table. Still, it was mine, and I felt a kind of quiet excitement unpacking my things, putting books on shelves and pictures on the walls, imagining how I would make it feel like home. The first night, I barely slept. I kept waking up to small sounds. Creaks from the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional thump from the apartment above. I told myself it was just the building settling, just the noises of living somewhere old. By the second night, though, the sounds started to feel more deliberate. Footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment, faint scratching on the walls, doors closing softly somewhere nearby. I checked the locks, all three of them, and even though they were secure, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At first, I tried to ignore it, convincing myself I was just anxious about being alone in a new place. But then small things began to happen. My keys would end up in different spots than I remembered leaving them. The TV would be on when I swore I had turned it off. Once, I even found the bathroom light on when I had definitely left it off. I chalked it up to forgetfulness or exhaustion. I had been working late at the hospital and pulling long shifts as a new nurse, and my body was exhausted. Then I started noticing shadows. I would see them moving in the corners of my vision, fleeting shapes that disappeared when I turned to look directly at them. The first time it really shook me was during a Tuesday night. I had fallen asleep on the couch while watching an old crime documentary, the TV muted. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of soft breathing right beside me. I froze, my heart hammering, and slowly turned my head. The living room was empty. I sat up, straining my ears, and the breathing stopped. I convinced myself it was a dream. But when I went to the bathroom a few minutes later, I noticed a faint smudge on the mirror, like someone had been leaning over it. Over the next week, the occurrences escalated. Objects moved, lights flickered, and the footsteps became louder, sometimes pacing, sometimes stopping abruptly. I started locking all the doors and windows, double-checking everything, yet I could still hear the sounds. It was as if someone or something was inside my apartment with me, but only when I wasn't looking. One night, I woke to a whisper. It was so soft I almost thought I imagined it. A single word, help. I sat up in bed, straining to hear more. My bedroom door was closed, but I could hear it again, coming from the living room. Trembling, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the dark room. Nothing. The whispering stopped. My pulse was racing, and I found myself sitting in the dark for hours, too scared to sleep. By morning, I tried to laugh it off as my imagination. A few days later, I came home to find a note on the kitchen counter. It was small, written in pencil on a scrap of paper I didn't recognize. The handwriting was sloppy, uneven, almost childlike. It read, "Don't sleep. They watch." I froze, my stomach dropping. I live alone. I never had visitors. My heart felt like it had stopped. I checked every room, every closet, under the bed. Nothing. The note was gone by the time I came back from work the next evening. I didn't mention it to anyone, mostly out of embarrassment, but I couldn't ignore it. Sleep became impossible. I started taking long walks at night just to avoid being alone in the apartment. The streets were quiet, almost too quiet, but it was better than sitting in the dark, waiting for something I couldn't see. I stopped watching TV, stopped using my laptop at night. My friends started asking if I was okay, but I lied, saying I was stressed from work. One night, around 3 a.m., I woke to a heavy thud from the ceiling. The apartment above me had been empty for months. The landlord confirmed that. The thud was followed by scraping, then a soft dragging sound. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking. The dispatcher told me they would send someone, but by the time the officer arrived, the sounds had stopped. He searched the apartment thoroughly and found nothing. I tried to explain the noises, the shadows, the whispers, but he just looked at me with a polite but skeptical expression. I felt ridiculous. I felt like I was losing my mind. After that, I tried to sleep during the day, but even then, the apartment seemed alive. The walls groaned, the floorboards creaked, and I started noticing scratches in places I was sure I hadn't touched. Once, I woke to see a figure at the foot of my bed. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark, blurry shape. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there. I blinked, and it was gone. My rational mind screamed at me, "It's a trick of the light, it's exhaustion," but every instinct told me it was real. I began recording the noises on my phone, hoping to capture something tangible. The recordings were unsettling. Footsteps, whispers, the sound of dragging, sometimes accompanied by low, guttural growls. Once, a recording captured a voice clearly saying, "Go." I couldn't stay there anymore. I started looking for a new apartment, but I didn't tell anyone why. I couldn't explain it without sounding insane. One rainy night, I decided to confront whatever was in my apartment. I stayed awake, sitting in the living room with the lights on, the blinds drawn, a baseball bat in my lap. Around 1 a.m., I heard it, a slow, deliberate tapping at the door. I didn't move. The tapping continued, growing louder, more insistent, like someone testing my resolve. I whispered, "Who's there?" The response was a low, menacing laugh, echoing through the apartment. My blood ran cold. I swung the door open, ready to strike, but there was nothing there. The hallway was empty, dark, silent. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and sank to the floor, shaking uncontrollably. That night, I didn't sleep at all. The next day, I went through old records of the building. I found something disturbing. Decades ago, a tenant in my unit had died under mysterious circumstances. The police report was vague, mentioning unnatural causes and unexplained injuries. The landlord had conveniently omitted this when I signed the lease. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a coincidence, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The final straw came one night around 2 a.m. I was lying in bed, trying to stay awake, when I heard scratching at the bedroom door. This time, it was accompanied by soft, rhythmic knocking. I called out, "Stop! Leave me alone!" The scratching stopped, replaced by a slow, deliberate creaking, like someone opening the closet door. I shone my flashlight toward it, and I saw it. A figure, taller than me, faceless, with long, thin limbs. It stood there, unmoving, watching. I screamed, ran to the door, and bolted out of the apartment. I didn't stop until I reached my car, trembling, soaked from the rain. I called a friend and asked if I could stay with them. I never went back to that apartment. I left all my things behind, rented a storage unit for essentials, and refused to talk to the landlord again. Even now, months later, I can't sleep without checking every corner of the room. Shadows seem to move in ways they shouldn't. I hear whispers when the house is silent, sometimes calling my name. I've moved twice since that apartment, but the fear lingers. Some nights, when it's quiet, I swear I feel a presence behind me, just standing there, watching. I've learned not to ignore it. Some things aren't imagination. Some things don't want to be seen, but they don't need to hide either. And some things follow you, even when you leave the place where it started. I don't know what was in that apartment, and I don't know if it's still out there, waiting. All I know is that I sleep with the lights on now every night, and I never ever go to bed thinking I'm alone. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I hear a faint scratching at my door. I pretend not to notice, but my hands tighten on the blanket, my eyes scan the shadows, and I whisper a quiet warning to myself. Don't fall asleep too deeply, because it's always closer than you think. And if you listen carefully, you might hear it too. Story the end. It started the week I moved into the apartment on Chestnut Street. I'd just gotten a new job in the city, and the apartment was affordable, clean, and on the third floor of an old brick building that had the kind of history you could feel in the walls. The rent was low for the neighborhood, which I chalked up to the place being vintage, as the listing said. But in retrospect, I should have noticed the warning signs in the way the previous tenant's furniture remained behind, or the way the windows rattled in the winter wind. I moved in on a Sunday afternoon, dragging boxes up 3 flights of stairs because the elevator had been out for months, according to the landlord. The place smelled faintly of dust and the lingering scent of cigarettes, though the unit had supposedly been smoke-free. I unpacked what I could, set up my bed, and tried to make the place feel like home. The first night, everything was quiet. A little too quiet, maybe. The sounds you expect from city living, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional siren, were there, but there was an emptiness inside the apartment itself. I chalked it up to the old construction. The walls were thick, and the wood floorboards groaned under every step. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of someone whispering. I froze, straining to hear over the pounding of my own heart. It sounded like a low, sibilant voice saying something I couldn't quite make out. I sat up, listening. The whispering stopped as suddenly as it had started. I convinced myself it was my imagination and went back to sleep. Over the next few nights, the whispering grew more frequent. Always around the same time, between 12:30 and 1 a.m., I'd hear soft voices, sometimes overlapping, this like people talking just outside my bedroom door. I checked the locks, peered through the peephole, and even shined my flashlight into the hallway. But the building was empty. One night I woke to a shadow moving across the bedroom wall. My bedroom faced the hallway, and for a split second, I thought I saw a figure leaning just outside the doorway. I screamed, fumbling for my phone, but when I turned the light on, there was nothing. I called the landlord the next day to ask about the neighbors. He said the floor above me had been vacant for months. The apartment next to mine had been empty for weeks as well. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was stress, or maybe I was just overreacting after a long day at work. But then the dreams started. At first they were minor, vivid, unsettling images that would fade when I woke up. A dark figure in my hallway, breathing softly, the sound of whispering that seemed to follow me through the dream, a knocking at my bedroom door that would wake me in a panic. Each morning I'd wake exhausted, heart racing, unable to shake the feeling that something had been in the room with me while I slept. A week in, I was lying in bed when I noticed something strange. The air felt heavier near the foot of my bed, like a pressure that shouldn't be there. I turned over and saw the outline of a person sitting in the dark, just at the edge of my vision. I blinked, and it vanished. I tried talking to friends about it, but I didn't want to sound crazy. Old building, I'd say. Drafts, imagination. But one friend insisted I get a camera, something to prove it to myself. I bought a cheap security camera and set it up in the corner of my bedroom, facing the door and the dark hallway beyond. The first night, nothing happened, or so I thought. I went to work the next day and checked the footage on my lunch break. At first, it was just static images of the empty room, until I noticed a dark shape standing at the foot of my bed at exactly 12:45 a.m. It didn't move for hours, just existed. Its outline was human, but it didn't look right. Too thin, too tall. Its head tilted slightly as if it were studying me. I felt a chill run through me that I couldn't shake for the rest of the day. I didn't sleep that night. I left the camera running, sat on the couch with the lights on, and tried to distract myself with TV. Around 12:40, I heard the whispering again. It wasn't muffled this time. It was clear, precise, coming from the direction of my bedroom. "Don't move," the voice said. I froze. My mind raced. I told myself it was still a dream or some elaborate auditory hallucination. But then the door handle rattled ever so slightly, like someone was testing the lock. I didn't call anyone. I didn't move. The sound stopped after a few minutes, and when I dared to look, the hallway was empty. I didn't sleep until dawn. The next week, the incidents escalated. Objects in the apartment moved on their own. Books fell off shelves, the blinds would shift even though the windows were closed. I began hearing footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth outside my bedroom door. Sometimes I could swear I heard breathing right behind me when I sat at my desk, working late at night. I started documenting everything, keeping a notebook of times, sounds, and experiences. My handwriting got sloppy, my notes frantic. I couldn't explain why, but I felt watched constantly, even during the day. One Thursday around 11 p.m., I was in the kitchen making a cup of tea when I heard it, the sound of the front door opening. I froze, heart thundering. I hadn't heard anyone enter the building. No one had come in. I peeked through the peephole, empty hallway. But when I stepped back, I noticed muddy footprints, small and narrow, leading from the front door toward the bedroom. I followed them, trembling, until I reached my bedroom. They stopped at the foot of the bed. I called the police that night. They arrived quickly, combed through the apartment, but found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no footprints outside. Nothing. They said sometimes old buildings have drafts that cause noises, that my mind could be playing tricks. But even as they spoke, I knew it wasn't my imagination. I wasn't crazy, I was terrified. After the police left, I tried to sleep in the living room. The whispering started again around 12:30. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The hallway was empty. I backed into the kitchen, trying to stay calm, when I noticed something moving in the corner of the living room. A shadow, elongated and crawling along the walls, moving toward me without making a sound. I screamed, stumbling backward, and the shadow froze, then retreated, as if it had been waiting for that moment. I locked myself in the bathroom and didn't leave until morning. I realized I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed what I could carry and went to stay with a friend outside the city. I told myself I'd deal with the apartment later. But even away from it, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. My dreams followed me, dark corridors and shadowy figures, whispering my name. I tried to research the building's history. It had been there since the 1920s. Former tenants reported strange noises, odd shadows, and objects moving on their own. One story mentioned a man who had died in the apartment decades ago, apparently of unknown causes, and that some tenants had claimed to see him sitting at the foot of their beds at night. I dismissed it at first, but as I lay in my friend's spare bedroom that night, the whispering returned. Soft, persistent, coming from the corner of the room where the shadows pooled. I held the sheets over my head, hoping it would stop, but I could still hear it. "Don't sleep," it said. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. My body gave in eventually, but my dreams were no longer dreams. They were visions. I would wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, to see the same shadowy figure at the foot of the bed, its head tilted, studying me. Weeks passed. I tried therapy, medication, logic, rational explanations. None of it worked. The figure followed me. The whispers never ceased. I couldn't explain how, but even miles away, I could feel it in the dark corners of every room I stayed in. I began keeping a light on, or at least a small lamp, but it didn't matter. It didn't seem to need darkness. One night, I woke up to find a note on my nightstand. My handwriting, except the words weren't mine. Written in a scrawling, uneven script were the words, "You can't leave. You never really left." I ran, of course. I drove to the furthest friend I had, stayed in motels, changed hotels every night, but the whispers were always there when the lights went out. My dreams became nightmares in which the figure was always closer, always reaching, its head cocked at an impossible angle, whispering things I couldn't understand but knew were meant to terrify me. I eventually realized I couldn't tell anyone because no one would believe me. The police couldn't help. Therapy didn't help. Friends were frightened, annoyed, or skeptical. I was alone with it. And the longer I stayed away from that apartment, the more it followed me, infiltrating every safe space I tried to create. Years have passed since I left Chestnut Street. I live in a small house in the suburbs now, far from the city, far from that apartment. I keep the blinds closed at night, never sleep in complete darkness, always leave the lights on. Yet when I close my eyes, I can still hear the whispering. I can still feel the figure leaning at the foot of my bed, studying me. It's patient. It waits, always. And I've learned that some things never leave, no matter how far you run, no matter how bright the lights. Story the end. It began the night I decided to move into the small rental house on the edge of town. It wasn't much: 2 bedrooms, a modest living room, a kitchen with cabinets that creaked when opened, and a back porch that overlooked a narrow stretch of woods. But the rent was reasonable, and I liked the idea of living somewhere quiet after years of noisy apartments in the city. I had visited the place twice before signing the lease, each time noticing the old-fashioned light switches and the way the floorboards groaned even under the lightest step. The landlord insisted that nothing had been wrong with the house, no history of break-ins, nothing unusual, though he did warn me that the previous tenant had left in a hurry, and he didn't know why. I didn't think much of it at the time. The first night I was alone, I unpacked a few boxes and set up my bed in the larger of the 2 bedrooms. It was late, probably close to 11 p.m., when I finally climbed into bed, exhausted from moving and rearranging furniture all afternoon. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I was scrolling on my phone when I heard it, a soft thump coming from the hallway. I froze, thinking maybe it was the floor settling or a branch hitting the window outside. But then it happened again, a low, deliberate thump, and I realized it was coming from the other bedroom, the one I wasn't using. "Hello?" I called softly, though my voice sounded absurdly loud in the stillness. No answer. I gritted my teeth, convincing myself I was imagining things. Old houses creak, floorboards settle, wind rattles the windows, all of it. I turned off my phone and tried to sleep, but the noise returned, softer this time, like a slow dragging sound moving across the floor. I held my breath, heart hammering, staring at the dark doorway of the unused bedroom. It stopped just as suddenly as it had started. I told myself it was nothing. Finally, after what felt like hours, I drifted off. The next morning, nothing seemed out of place. I checked the unused bedroom, windows locked, door closed, floorboards untouched. Maybe I really had imagined it. That evening, I made a small dinner and watched TV in the living room. Around 10:30, I heard the faintest creak from upstairs. My bedroom was directly above the living room, so I froze, trying to convince myself it was a board settling or the house shifting with the wind. But then I heard it again. Slow, deliberate footsteps pacing across the floor. I realized with a sinking feeling that it wasn't just pacing. It was moving directly above me. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The living room was empty. Every door and window was closed. I tried to call my friend, but the signal was weak, and I kept dropping the call. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with the TV on, lights everywhere, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. The next few nights were worse. I started hearing things even when I was in bed, my phone barely illuminating the dark corners of the room. Footsteps above me, creaking floorboards, the faint sound of whispering. Sometimes I thought I heard a door slam. I started sleeping with the bedroom door locked, and I installed a chain lock on the front door, but the noises never stopped. One night, around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of breathing. Soft, slow, deliberate. It was coming from the living room. I lay frozen in bed, heart racing, straining to hear. The breathing continued for several minutes, just loud enough for me to know it was real. I wanted to call the police, but I was afraid of being laughed at. What would I say? There's someone in my house, but I don't know who or why. I eventually got up and crept toward the living room, holding my phone in front of me like a weapon. The lights from the screen cut through the darkness, and I saw nothing. Nothing at all. The furniture was in the exact place I had left it. The air smelled faintly of dust, the way it always did. But when I turned back toward the stairs, I saw the living room door, the one that led to the small hallway and the kitchen, was wide open. I hadn't opened it. Panic surged through me. I ran to the door and yanked it closed, checking the locks again. Every window was still locked, every door secure. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold my phone. I tried to convince myself it was a draft, but the door hadn't moved before I touched it. Over the next week, the activity escalated. Objects would move on their own, books sliding off shelves, kitchen utensils not where I'd left them. I started leaving notes for myself. Did you move this? Or check if the door is locked. I kept a small camera in the living room, hoping to catch whatever was happening on tape. But every morning, the camera would show nothing. No shadows, no movement, nothing. Yet the evidence was there. Overturned chairs, scuff marks on the floor, a window slightly ajar despite my double-checking the night before. One night, desperate for sleep, I set up a small tape recorder in my bedroom before bed. I told myself I would finally have proof. Around 3 a.m., the recorder picked up the faintest whispers. I couldn't make out the words, but they were there. Soft, deliberate, coming from the corner of the room. I bolted upright in bed and saw nothing. The air was still. The room was dark. Yet I felt it, an undeniable presence, something watching, lingering. I didn't sleep again that night. I left all the lights on and sat in the living room until dawn. By morning, I was exhausted, on the verge of panic. I called my friend Jenna, who had always been a rational person. I didn't even try to hide my fear. "Jenna, I think something's in the house with me," I said, my voice trembling. "Are you sure it's not just stress?" she asked, uncertain. I can't explain it. I hear it. I see things move. Doors open, objects move. I feel like someone is here, even when I'm alone." There was a long pause. Maybe you should stay with me for a few nights?" I agreed without hesitation. I packed a bag and left, but when I returned a week later to collect the last of my things, the house felt wrong, different. The air was heavier, the silence oppressive. I tried to move quickly, grabbing boxes and shoving them into my car. But as I turned to leave, I heard it again, the slow scrape of footsteps, deliberate, coming from the upstairs hallway. I froze, the last box in my hands, staring at the stairwell. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I told myself I was imagining it, but then I saw it. Something reflected in the mirror in the hallway. A shadow, indistinct, standing just beyond the bedroom doors. I spun around. Nothing. I ran to the car, doors locked, engine running. As I drove away, I dared a glance in the rearview mirror. The house sat there, quiet, but I could swear I saw a figure in the upstairs window. Not moving, just watching. I never went back. I changed my phone number, moved to a different town, avoided telling anyone too many details. But at night, when the wind is right and the shadows stretch long across the walls of my apartment, I sometimes hear it, the soft scraping, the deliberate footsteps, the whispers just beyond the reach of light. And I know, somewhere out there, that house is still waiting, still listening, still alive in some way I can't explain. Even now, I can feel it sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, like a presence leaning just over my shoulder, watching, patient, waiting. Story the end. It began on a Sunday evening in early November, when the sky was a dull gray and the wind had begun to pick up the first fallen leaves, tossing them into the streets like paper ghosts. I had just finished unpacking the last of my boxes in my new apartment in a small town in upstate New York. The apartment was on the second floor of an old brick building built in the 1920s, with creaking floors and a faint smell of mildew that lingered despite my cleaning. Moving in had been exhausting, and I had promised myself a quiet night in, a cup of coffee, and a good book. By the time the sun disappeared behind the hills, the apartment was dimly lit, only the warm glow of a small lamp illuminating the living room. I settled onto the couch, curled under a blanket, and tried to focus on the story in front of me, but there was a subtle unease I couldn't shake. The wind outside pressed against the windows with a low, insistent howl, and every so often the floorboards creaked in a way that seemed too deliberate for an empty building. I first noticed it around 10:30 p.m., a faint tapping at the window in the living room. At first, I thought it was just a branch brushing against the glass, but then it came again, a soft, rhythmic tap, almost like a finger drumming. I paused my reading, staring at the window, trying to convince myself it was nothing. When the sound stopped, I told myself I had imagined it. Hours passed, and the apartment grew colder. I could see my breath in the dim light of the lamp, though I had the heat on. The shadows seemed longer than they should have been, stretching along the walls and floor in ways that made me uneasy. Around 2 a.m., I woke to another sound, soft scraping coming from the kitchen. My first thought was a mouse, but the sound was too deliberate, moving slowly across the floor. My heart raced. I kept my phone in my hand, shining its light toward the kitchen. Nothing moved. I tried to fall back asleep, but the noises persisted. Scratching from the walls, footsteps that seemed to circle the apartment, whispers too faint to understand. I was exhausted, but too frightened to close my eyes. Eventually, I drifted off, only to wake again in the early morning hours, feeling watched. Over the next few days, the events escalated. I started noticing small things out of place. My keys on the counter when I was certain I had left them in my bag. The living room chair moved an inch from where I had left it. A glass of water half full on the table, though I hadn't poured one. I began setting up cameras in the apartment, just to see what was happening when I wasn't looking. The footage shocked me. At first, it showed normal empty rooms, but later, around 1:47 a.m., the living room camera captured something impossible. A shadow moved across the floor, darker than the rest of the room. It had shape, vaguely humanoid, but its movements were too jerky, too fast. It paused, as if noticing the camera, then vanished. I watched, heart pounding, as the shadow returned to the same spot multiple nights in a row, always at the same time, always moving in the same unnatural way. I began to feel it even when I wasn't looking at the screens. A presence, heavy and silent, always at the edge of my vision. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of movement in the corner of my eyes, just a flicker, gone when I turned my head. And always there was the sound of breathing. Not human breathing, deep and wet, as if the air itself were exhaling slowly around me. One evening I came home from work and found the apartment unusually cold, the lights flickering as I entered. My living room table was set with objects I hadn't touched. A knife from the kitchen, a glass of water, and a small, folded piece of paper. The paper was heavy, textured, almost like it had been carved instead of written on. On it, in uneven letters, it said, "I'm here." I dropped it immediately, backing away. My phone was in my pocket. I tried calling my friend, but the line was dead. The nights grew worse. I stopped sleeping in my bedroom, instead curling up on the couch with all the lights on. Every sound was magnified. The hum of the refrigerator, the wind scratching at the windows, the soft thump of my own heartbeat. One night, I woke to the sound of someone whispering my name. It wasn't my imagination. I could hear the syllables distinctly, soft but sharp in the darkness. I sat up, shining my phone around the room, but the apartment was empty. Then the scratching began again, this time from inside the walls. At first, it was faint, almost polite, but it grew louder each night. I could hear it moving, circling, stopping just out of reach, but it was always accompanied by the faintest creak of floorboards. I started hearing footsteps above me as well, though the building was empty except for me. The landlord had assured me the apartment was vacant on my floor. Around the third week, I noticed something new. Marks on the walls, long, thin scratches, vertical and deep, appearing overnight. I had checked the walls before moving in. They hadn't been there. The scratches formed patterns I couldn't understand, almost like some kind of code or message. My unease turned into terror when I realized that the scratches seemed to form a trail, leading from my bedroom toward the living room and then to the window. One particularly cold night, I woke to a loud crash from the kitchen. My heart was in my throat as I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the sound. The kitchen window was open, even though I had locked it before bed. The screen was torn, hanging in tatters. I looked outside. Empty street, no cars, no footprints in the thin layer of fallen leaves. When I turned back inside, the knife from the table in the living room was now on the floor, blade pointing toward the living room doorway. I called the police that night, my voice shaking. They came, took a report, checked the apartment thoroughly. No signs of forced entry other than the torn screen, no fingerprints, no evidence of anyone having been inside. They assured me the apartment was empty. I didn't sleep that night, huddled in a corner of the living room, flashlight in hand. After that, I began documenting everything. Every sound, every movement, every shadow. I noted the times. The shadow always appeared around 1:47 a.m. The scratches appeared every night between 2 and 3 a.m. The whispers never failed to come just after 3. I couldn't leave the apartment anymore. The presence seemed to follow me when I tried. Friends offered to let me stay with them, but even outside, I felt it, just beyond my vision, waiting. One night, desperate, I decided to confront it. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, camera recording, bat in hand. Around 1:47 a.m. as expected, the shadow appeared, stretching across the floor, unnaturally tall, limbs moving like broken hinges. My flashlight illuminated it partially, but when I swung it directly, it passed through nothing, as if the air itself had thickened into a shape. Then I heard it, a low guttural laugh coming from all directions. It echoed in my skull. "You shouldn't be here," it said, the words scraping against my ears. "You never should have come." I ran. Out the door, down the street, leaves crunching beneath my feet. The air was cold, biting at my face, but I didn't stop. When I looked back, I thought I saw it at the window, eyes glowing faintly, staring at me. I didn't stop running until I reached a friend's house across town. I haven't returned to that apartment since. The lease is still active, but I can't bring myself to step inside. The cameras I set up continue to record, and when I check remotely, I can still see it. The shadow, standing in the same corners, moving in the same unnatural way. I've changed phones, changed my routines, but the messages keep coming. On the screen, through texts I never sent, the words appear: "I see you. You can't hide. Still watching." I sleep in a friend's spare room now, but even there I feel the presence. In the middle of the night, I can hear it. Breathing, scratching, whispers. I know it's patient, waiting for the moment I let my guard down. Sometimes in dreams it comes closer, tilting its head, eyes glowing, standing just at the edge of the room, and when I wake, I feel the same dread, the same heavy weight, pressing down. I don't know what it wants or why it's attached to me, but I know one thing: it isn't going anywhere, and neither am I. Story the end. It started with the sound of dripping. At first, I thought it was just the sink in the bathroom, old pipes maybe, or the loose faucet I'd been meaning to fix. It was just past midnight, the kind of heavy quiet that only happens in a small town like ours. The street outside was dead, just an occasional hum of a car in the distance, and I was lying in bed, phone in hand, trying to read until my eyes got heavy. But the drip kept going. Drip, drip, drip. I got up, rubbing at my face, annoyed. The house was my grandmother's place, the one I inherited after she passed last year. It wasn't anything special: 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a porch that creaked when the wind blew. I'd been slowly fixing it up, room by room, but the bathroom was still dated, with chipped tiles and a medicine cabinet that wouldn't close all the way. When I walked in, the sink was dry. I turned the handle just to check, and the pipes groaned like they always did, but nothing came out. I leaned down, peered into the bowl, and put my hand along the porcelain, still bone dry. That's when I realized the dripping was coming from somewhere else. I stood still and listened. The noise was faint, but steady, like water hitting wood, not porcelain. It sounded like it was coming from the back of the house. I told myself it was nothing. Probably the gutters, maybe it rained earlier and I hadn't noticed. The weather had been weird that week, hot and sticky during the day, cool at night. I went back to bed, shut my eyes, and let the soft hum of my fan fill the room until I drifted off. The next morning, I found muddy footprints by the back door. They were small, maybe a size 8 or 9, and they trailed from the grass just beyond the porch across the deck and stopped right at the kitchen door. The screen door was shut, but the lock on the wooden door inside had been flipped open. I stared at it for a long minute, my stomach tight, then walked through the house. Nothing seemed out of place. The windows were locked, my wallet was still on the counter, and my old dog, Max, was curled up on the rug like nothing had happened. I told myself maybe I'd forgotten to lock the door the night before. Maybe I'd tracked in the mud myself without realizing it, though the footprints didn't look like mine. That night, I triple-checked the locks before going to bed. The dripping started again around 1 in the morning. This time I sat up, heart thudding, and just listened. The sound wasn't random. It had a rhythm to it. Drip, drip, drip. Like someone wringing out a wet rag onto the floor. I grabbed the flashlight I kept in the nightstand and got up, every step feeling heavier than the last as I made my way toward the kitchen. The house was silent, except for that steady dripping. The beam from my flashlight cut across the small living room, set the linoleum floor in the kitchen glowing pale under the light. There, near the back door, was a small puddle. The footprints were there again, only this time they were fresh, damp, and darker against the floor. They led from the back door to the hallway and disappeared around the corner. I froze. Max let out a low growl from the bedroom, the kind of sound that rumbled in his throat when a stranger walked too close to the yard. I didn't follow the prints. I backed into my room, locked the door, and sat on the bed, clutching the flashlight like it was a weapon. The sound of dripping went on for hours. In the morning, the footprints were gone. No damp spots, no mud. The floor was clean, almost too clean, like it had been wiped down. I called my friend Mark later that day. He was one of those practical types, never spooked by anything. He laughed when I told him, said it was probably some raccoon or stray animal I'd let in without realizing. He offered to come by that night, hang out for a bit, maybe help me figure out what was going on. Mark showed up just after dark, a six-pack in hand and a grin on his face. We sat in the living room, the old box fan buzzing in the corner, and waited. Nothing happened for hours. By midnight, Mark was snoring on the couch, and I was starting to think maybe I really had imagined the whole thing. Then the dripping started. Mark sat up fast, rubbing his face. "What the hell is that?" I just pointed toward the kitchen. We moved quietly, slowly toward the back of the house, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The back door was open, not just unlocked. Open, swinging slightly in the night breeze. The yard was pitch black, the tree line a jagged silhouette against the dim glow of the moon. "Did you?" Mark started, but then stopped. The footprints were there again, darker this time, soaked into the wood of the deck and trailing inside. And then we both heard it, a wet, sucking sound, like someone shifting their feet in mud, coming from down the hall. Mark swore under his breath and whispered for me to call the cops. I didn't argue. My hands shook so bad I nearly dropped my phone as I dialed 911. The dispatcher told me to stay inside, stay quiet, and wait for the officers to arrive. Mark grabbed the old baseball bat I kept by the door, his face pale. We stayed there, silent, the dripping growing louder and closer until it sounded like it was right around the corner. The front door banged open 10 minutes later, the beam of a flashlight slicing through the house. Two officers stepped in, voices low but steady as they called out. They searched every room, every closet, even the crawl space. They didn't find anyone. When they came back, one of the officers, a younger guy with dark circles under his eyes, looked uneasy. He said there were no fresh footprints outside, nothing to suggest anyone had been in the yard, let alone inside the house. But as they left, I saw the older cop glance back at the hallway, his jaw tight like he'd seen something he didn't want to talk about. After that night, Mark stopped coming over. He made excuses, said work was keeping him busy, but I could hear it in his voice. Whatever he'd heard that night had gotten under his skin. The dripping never stopped. Some nights it would be faint, almost easy to ignore, but other nights it was deafening, echoing through the house until it was all I could hear. I stopped sleeping in my bedroom and started crashing on the couch, TV on low, just to drown it out. Then Max disappeared. I let him out one evening, same as always. He ran out into the yard, tail wagging, and never came back. I called his name until my throat was raw, walked the property line with a flashlight, even drove around the neighborhood asking if anyone had seen him. No one had. The next morning, there were wet footprints leading up to the porch again. This time, they didn't stop at the door. They trailed down the hall into the living room and stopped right in front of the couch where I'd been sleeping. That was when I decided to leave. I packed a bag, locked up the house, and drove to a motel in town. The first night there, I slept better than I had in weeks. No dripping, no footsteps, just quiet. When I went back the next day to grab more clothes, the house felt wrong. The air was heavy, humid, like walking into a room after someone's been crying. The footprints were everywhere, across the kitchen, up the walls, even on the ceiling, like someone had been crawling above me while I slept. I didn't stay. I drove back to the motel and never looked back. The house is still there, sitting empty on that quiet street, like the porch creaking when the wind blows. Sometimes late at night when I'm lying in bed, I swear I can still hear it. Drip, drip, drip. Story the end. It started on a night so quiet that even the usual hum of traffic from the interstate a few miles away seemed to fade into nothing. The kind of silence that feels heavy, like the world is holding its breath. I had been lying in bed for about an hour, tossing from one side to the other, unable to find a position that felt right. Sleep had been hard to come by lately, and not just because of stress. It was something else, something I couldn't put my finger on, though the unease had been growing for days. I live in a small one-bedroom apartment in upstate New York. Nothing fancy. Second floor, end of the hallway, with a view of the narrow alley behind the building where the dumpsters sit. Most nights, The alley was empty except for a stray cat or two. But that night, as I lay there staring at the faint orange glow of the streetlight spilling through the blinds, I had this gnawing feeling I wasn't alone. Not in the apartment. I'd checked the locks twice before, but outside, watching. It started with a soft scraping sound. At first, I thought it was just a raccoon nosing through the trash, but then it came again, sharp, deliberate. Metal against metal, like someone dragging a nail or a coin along the side of the dumpster. I froze, holding my breath. My heart was already thudding too fast, and I found myself straining to hear past the silence. Then I saw it, just the faintest shadow moving in the alley. It wasn't a trick of the light. The shape shifted slightly, slow and purposeful. I sat up, pulling the blinds apart just enough to see without being obvious. There was a man standing there, just at the edge of the streetlight's reach. He was tall, with his head tilted back like he was looking up at my window. At first, I told myself it was just a neighbor, someone out for a smoke, maybe. But nobody in this building smokes, at least not outside. And the way he was standing, perfectly still, shoulders slightly hunched, felt wrong. His face was in shadow, but I swear I could feel his eyes locked on me. I let the blinds fall back into place, my hands trembling. For a few seconds, I sat there in the dark, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But then the scraping started again. Louder this time. A slow, grating sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I dared to peek outside, the alley was empty. No man, no sound. By morning, I almost convinced myself I had just been half dreaming. The second night, it happened again. Same time, just after midnight. I'd been watching TV, volume low, when that scraping noise started up. This time, I didn't look right away. I sat frozen on the couch, the remote gripped so tightly in my hand that my knuckles ached. When I finally got up, enough courage to look, I saw him again. He was standing closer to the building this time, right beneath my window, looking up. His clothes were plain, a dark hoodie and jeans, but they hung off him in a way that made me think they didn't fit right, like they belonged to someone else. He didn't move, didn't say a word, just stood there, head tilted back, watching. I wanted to call someone, the police, a friend, anyone, but what would I even say? There's a man standing in the alley looking at my window. Doesn't exactly sound urgent when you don't have proof. So I closed the blinds, turned off the TV, and sat in the corner of my living room with my phone in my hand, staring at the door. He stayed for hours. I know, because every time I worked up the courage to peek, he was still there, motionless. He didn't leave until the sky started to lighten with dawn. By the third night, I was too terrified to sleep at all. I double-checked the locks, wedged a chair under the doorknob, even turned on the hallway light to make myself feel safer. It didn't help. At exactly 12:03 a.m., the scraping started again. Louder. Longer. This time, I didn't look. I couldn't. I just lay there in the dark, blanket pulled up to my chin, listening as the sound moved slowly along the side of the building, then stopped. And then came the knock. 3 sharp raps on the back door of the building. I could hear the echo of it traveling up the stairwell. No one else in the building seemed to notice. No doors opened. No voices murmured. It was like the world outside my apartment didn't exist anymore. By the 5th night, I was unraveling. My eyes burned from lack of sleep. My hands trembled constantly, and every sound made me jump. I stopped going to work, too afraid to leave the apartment for more than a few minutes. Food delivery was the only reason I unlocked the door at all. I thought about telling my landlord, but what would that do? He barely fixed the broken heater last winter. A report of some creepy guy in the alley wouldn't even make his list of priorities. Then came the 6th night. I'll never forget that one. I was sitting on the floor of my living room with my back against the couch, the TV off, phone clutched in my hand like a lifeline. Midnight came and went without a sound. For a while, I thought maybe it was over. Maybe whoever he was had finally gotten bored and moved on. At 12:47, I heard the click. It was the unmistakable sound of my front door handle turning, slow and deliberate. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up as the handle rattled gently, rose testing the lock. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The scraping started again a few minutes later, but this time it wasn't coming from the alley. It was coming from my front door. A slow, deliberate, dragging sound, like metal sliding along wood. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I packed a bag and drove to my sister's house 2 towns over. She thought I was being paranoid, said maybe it was just some homeless guy looking for a place to crash, but she let me sleep in her guest room anyway. For the first time in a week, I felt like I could breathe. I stayed there for 2 nights. Nothing happened. No scraping, no knocking, no shadow standing in the dark. When I finally worked up the nerve to go back to my apartment, everything looked normal. Too normal. No sign that anyone had been there at all. My locks were intact. My windows closed. Even the alley looked clean, the dumpsters pushed neatly against the wall. That night, I sat on the couch with the lights on, waiting. Midnight came and went without a sound. I almost convinced myself it was over, until my phone buzzed at 3:12 a.m. It was a text from an unknown number. No words, just a photo. It was a picture of my bedroom window, taken from the alley. Story the end. The first time I heard the noise, I told myself it was nothing. Old buildings make sounds, especially in small towns like ours. I just moved into the little one-bedroom apartment above the old hardware store on Maple Street. Rent was cheap, and the place had character. High ceilings, old wooden floors, and tall windows that let in just enough light to make me feel less alone at night. I had been living there for 2 weeks, settling into the quiet, learning the rhythms of the town, when I started to notice it. A faint scraping sound, like someone dragging their nails slowly along the underside of the floorboards. It came late, usually around midnight, when the traffic died, and the only sound left was the occasional bark of a stray dog somewhere in the distance. At first, I thought it was just pipes or maybe an animal. It was an old building. Things creaked and shifted. I ignored it for a few nights, rolled over, and pulled the thin blanket up to my chin, telling myself it was nothing. But then the noise changed. One night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to a sharp tap on the wall near my bed. Just one, like a single knuckle hitting the plaster. I froze, my heart racing in my chest, listening. Another tap came, a little louder this time, closer to where my head was resting against the wall. I sat up slowly, my breath shallow. My phone screen lit up as I checked the time, 2:07 a.m. The blue light of the lock screen glowed against the walls, and that was when I realized something that made my stomach twist. There was no one living in the unit next to mine. That side of the building had been empty for months, according to the landlord. I stayed awake until dawn, sitting on the couch with the TV on low, trying to convince myself that it had been a random noise, some quirk of the old building I hadn't noticed before. By morning, I had almost convinced myself I was imagining things. Almost. The next night, I decided to test it. I stayed up late, lying in bed with the lights off, staring at the ceiling and waiting. Midnight passed quietly. At 1, the old pipes groaned as the temperature dropped outside. By 2, my eyes were heavy and I was just starting to drift off when it happened again. Tap. This time I sat up immediately, my heart hammering in my chest. Tap, tap, tap. 3 quick knocks, spaced out but deliberate, right against the wall by my bed. I whispered, my voice barely audible in the stillness. "Who's there?" No answer. For a moment everything was silent. Then, faintly, I heard it, scraping, like fingernails dragging across the wall. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called the landlord. I tried to sound casual as I explained that I'd been hearing noises, like someone knocking on the walls. He chuckled, told me it was probably just the building settling, and reminded me that no one had been in that unit for months. His voice sounded far away, like he was distracted, and when I pressed him, asked if there was any way someone could have a key, he just muttered something about small-town nonsense and hung up. I started keeping a light on in the bedroom after that. It helped, a little, but not much. The noises kept coming, sometimes soft, sometimes louder, always between midnight and 3 a.m. Sometimes I'd hear faint whispers, too low to make out words, but enough to raise the hair on the back of my neck. A week later, I saw the handprint. It was early morning, around 6, and the sun was just starting to rise. I'd finally managed to sleep a little and woke up groggy, my eyes gritty from exhaustion. When I sat up, I noticed something on the inside of the bedroom window. A smudge. I walked closer, rubbing my eyes, and froze when I saw it clearly. A handprint. It was faint but unmistakable, pressed into the condensation on the glass from the cold night air. 5 fingers, long and thin, too long, splayed out wide. I checked the lock on the window, found it still latched tight, and just stood there staring, my breath coming out in shaky clouds. I scrubbed the print off with my sleeve, trying to convince myself it had been there from the previous tenant, that maybe I just never noticed it before. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I didn't even bother going to bed. I sat in the living room with the lights on, clutching a mug of coffee that had gone cold hours earlier, my phone clutched in my other hand. Around 1:30, I heard the scraping again. This time it wasn't coming from the wall. It was coming from the ceiling, slow and deliberate, moving from one side of the room to the other. I called the landlord again the next morning, but he didn't answer. I left a voicemail, my voice shaking as I asked if anyone had been in the building, if there was any chance someone was messing with me. He never called me back. By the end of the second week, I was barely sleeping. My eyes burned, my hands trembled, and every sound made me jump. I started keeping the kitchen knife next to me at night, just in case. Then came the night everything changed. It was a Thursday. I remember because I had been so tired that evening that I almost left work early, but the thought of being alone in that apartment made my skin crawl. When I finally got home around 10, I kept every light on, turned the TV up, and tried to drown out the silence. By midnight, I was on the couch, half asleep with the knife still within reach. At some point, the hum of the TV faded, replaced by something else. Whispering. It was faint at first, so quiet I thought I was imagining it, but then it grew louder, clearer, a voice low and raspy calling my name. Elliot. I froze, every muscle in my body going rigid. Elliot. The voice was right behind me. I spun around, the knife clutched in my hand, but the room was empty. Just me, the flickering light from the TV, and the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day I packed a bag. I didn't even care about the rest of my things. I just needed to get out. But when I tried the door, it wouldn't open. The deadbolt turned, the knob turned, but the door stayed stuck like it was glued shut. I pulled, slammed my shoulder against it until my arm throbbed, but it wouldn't budge. That was when I heard it, the slow, dragging footsteps coming down the hallway outside. I backed away from the door, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. The footsteps stopped just on the other side, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, softly, right against the wood, came the sound of someone breathing. I don't remember falling asleep that night. I just remember waking up on the floor the next morning, the door wide open, like nothing had happened. I left that day, didn't even look back. I moved 3 towns over, found a new job, and tried to pretend it had all been in my head. But some nights when I'm lying in bed just starting to drift off, I swear I can still hear it. That slow, deliberate scraping. And every morning, no matter where I am, there's a handprint on my window. Story the end. It was just after 9 when Rachel finally turned off the television and dragged herself to the bedroom. She'd been trying to break her habit of falling asleep on the couch every night, the glow of the screen painting her dreams with half-remembered commercials and snippets of shows she'd never really watched. But tonight, the little one-bedroom apartment felt heavier somehow. It was quiet, too quiet, as if the whole building was holding its breath. She shook the feeling off, reminding herself that she'd been stressed at work all week and exhaustion was making her paranoid. She lived alone, something that had taken her a while to get used to after breaking up with her boyfriend 2 months ago. The rent was manageable, the neighbors quiet, and the little street in this tucked-away corner of suburban Ohio felt safe. Safe enough that she never double-checked her locks until tonight, when a strange unease made her do just that. She walked through the apartment slowly, hand trailing the wall, checking every window latch, every door bolt, every closet. She even opened the bathroom shower curtain, half laughing at herself for being ridiculous. By the time she made it back to her bedroom, the silence was loud. She could hear the hum of her refrigerator through the wall, the faint tick of the ceiling fan's motor. She set her phone on the nightstand and lay back, pulling the covers up to her chin. It took a while for her mind to stop racing. She scrolled through a few messages, turned her phone face down, and let her eyelids drift shut. Somewhere between waking and dreaming, she thought she heard it. A soft shuffle, like bare feet dragging across her living room carpet. Her eyes snapped open. her body locked tight. She held her breath and strained her ears, waiting. Nothing. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the soft whir of the fan. She told herself it was the upstairs neighbor, or maybe the pipes. She rolled over, clutching the blanket tighter, and forced her eyes shut again. The sound came again, closer this time. She sat up, pulse hammering against her ribs. Her phone was right there, a glowing rectangle within reach. Her hand hovered over it, her thumb brushing the screen before she stopped herself. What would she even say if she called someone? That she thought she heard a noise? That she was scared in her own apartment like some kid spooked by a thunderstorm? She swung her legs off the bed, toes curling against the cool hardwood, and listened again. Silence. Still, she stood up and padded toward the door, her steps quiet out of instinct. She flipped on the hallway light and squinted against its brightness. The living room was empty. The kitchen, too. She stood there for a moment, just breathing, until the tightness in her chest loosened enough for her to laugh at herself. "You're losing it," she muttered under her breath, her voice too small in the empty room. She made herself a glass of water, sat at the counter until her nerves calmed, and finally went back to bed. By the time she curled up again, the clock on her nightstand read 12:17. Sleep didn't come easy. Her dreams were jagged and restless, full of warped faces and dark hallways that led nowhere. She woke to the sound of her phone vibrating violently against the nightstand. Disoriented, she fumbled for it, eyes half closed. No one was calling, no missed calls, no messages. The phone was still on silent mode, just as she'd left it. That was when she realized the sound wasn't her phone at all. It was coming from the kitchen. She froze, ears straining again. There it was, 3 slow knocks, hollow and deliberate, echoing through the thin walls of her apartment. She sat upright, heart stuttering. It could be someone at her door, she thought, someone knocking. But the sound hadn't come from the front door. It had come from inside, the small, windowless kitchen where there was nothing and no one. Her throat went dry as she slid quietly out of bed again, every muscle tensed. She reached for the baseball bat she kept in the corner, a leftover comfort from when she'd first moved in. She gripped it so hard her fingers ached, stepping carefully down the short hall. The kitchen light flickered on when she flipped the switch. Nothing. Her small table sat untouched, the dishes in the sink just as she'd left them, the hum of the refrigerator steady. She took one more cautious step forward, every hair on her body standing on end. Something shifted. Not loud, not obvious, just movement. A shadow near the far wall, gone before she could blink. She backed out slowly, keeping her eyes fixed on the room even as her fingers fumbled for the hallway light switch. She locked her bedroom door the second she was inside, twisting the lock twice for good measure. Sleep was impossible after that. She sat in her bed with the bat across her lap, her phone clutched in her hand, and waited for morning. The sun brought with it a strange relief, like the light alone had burned away whatever tension had seeped into the walls. She checked every corner of the apartment, every closet, under the bed. Nothing. No sign of anyone, no sign of anything. By evening, she'd convinced herself she'd imagined it. Maybe it had been a dream. She'd been exhausted, running on too much coffee and too little rest. Maybe her brain had filled the quiet with noise that wasn't there. She left the television on that night, the soft murmur of a late-night infomercial filling the air, and fell asleep to its static comfort. But at exactly 3:09 a.m., the television cut out. The sudden silence jolted her awake. She sat up, eyes wide, staring at the black screen. Then she heard it again, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, pacing the length of her living room. The bat was already in her hands before her mind had even caught up. She didn't move, didn't breathe. She sat frozen, gripping the bat so tightly her knuckles turned white, while the footsteps dragged closer. Stopped just outside her bedroom door. And then, in the deafening silence, the handle turned. Her breath caught. The lock held, the faint click of resistance sounding louder than any scream could have. The handle turned again, harder this time. The wood of the door rattled against the frame. Rachel scrambled off the bed, her voice trembling as she shouted, "I'm calling the police!" Silence. She waited, shaking, every second stretching into eternity. Then, slowly, the footsteps retreated. She listened to them fade into the living room, then down the hall, then nothing. When the police arrived 15 minutes later, they found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no fingerprints, nothing on the security camera feed outside the building. The officer, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, gave her a sympathetic look and said what she'd been dreading. You probably just dreamed it. But Rachel knew. And that night, when she forced herself to stay awake, she saw it. Not a person, not really. Just the suggestion of something wrong. A figure standing in the farthest corner of her living room where the shadows pooled deepest, watching her with a stillness that made her stomach twist. It never moved, never spoke. It just stood there, waiting. Story the end. The first time Emily heard the noise, she thought it was just the wind. The house was old, built in the late 1940s on a quiet street that dead-ended into a stretch of woods, and it groaned with every shift in temperature. She had been living there for just over 3 weeks, still surrounded by half-unpacked boxes and that faint smell of fresh paint that clung to every wall. It had been a long day, unloading new furniture, organizing her bedroom, running errands, and by the time she finally crawled into bed, the only thing she wanted was silence. But then, in that fragile stillness between awake and asleep, there it was. A sharp, distinct scrape. It came from downstairs, maybe the kitchen. She froze, her body stiff under the comforter, listening. At first, she convinced herself it was the old refrigerator humming or maybe something shifting on the counter. She held her breath, straining to hear anything else, but the house went completely silent again. Emily exhaled slowly and tried to relax, her hand finding her phone on the nightstand. No new messages. She checked the time, 1:47 a.m., and put the phone back, letting her eyes close. The next morning, the sound felt almost like a dream. By the third night, it didn't. It started around the same time, a scraping sound that lasted a few seconds, then stopped. The first night, it had been one scrape. The second night, 2. And now, on the third night, it repeated 3 times in quick succession. She sat up in bed this time, heart pounding, and flicked on the bedside lamp. "Hello?" she called out, her voice small in the empty house. Nothing. Just the hum of the ceiling fan overhead and the faint chirp of crickets outside the window. She waited, holding her breath until her chest ached, then slid out of bed and crept toward the stairs. Her bare feet were silent on the old wooden steps as she descended into the darkness. She flicked on the light in the hallway, then the kitchen. Everything was exactly as she left it. Keys in the bowl by the door, purse on the counter, half-full glass of water still sitting by the sink. The front and back doors were locked tight. Emily shook her head, trying to laugh it off, and went back upstairs, though sleep didn't come easily after that. By the end of the first week, the noises weren't just at night anymore. She'd be in the living room, half distracted by her laptop, and hear what sounded like soft, deliberate footsteps upstairs. Or she'd step out of the shower and swear she heard someone whispering just beyond the door, low enough that she couldn't make out words. She told herself it was just her mind playing tricks on her. New house, new noises. Maybe the wind caught in the eaves, or a squirrel found its way into the attic. She kept repeating that until it almost felt true. Almost. The night everything shifted. She had stayed up late, binge-watching a series on her laptop. The clock on the stove read 2:13 a.m. when she finally stood, stretched, and shut off the lights before heading upstairs. The house was silent except for the distant ticking of the wall clock in the hallway. She brushed her teeth, climbed into bed, and turned off the lamp. Sleep had just started to take her when something cold brushed against her ankle under the blanket. Her eyes snapped open, but the room was pitch black. She froze, barely breathing, waiting for movement, for anything. Nothing. She forced herself to sit up, her hand fumbling for her phone to use as a flashlight. She swept the dim glow across the room, dresser, closet door slightly ajar, the mirror above the vanity reflecting her own pale, wide-eyed face. Nothing looked out of place. Her throat felt dry as she whispered, "Get it together, Em." She didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, she found the back door wide open. It hadn't just been unlocked. It was wide open, swinging slightly in the morning breeze. She stood there frozen, clutching her coffee mug, her mind racing with explanations. She never used that door except to take out the trash, and she knew she'd locked it the night before. She called her friend Jenna after work that day, trying to keep her voice light, but her hands were trembling as she spoke. "Maybe it's just the house settling," Jenna said. Those old places are weird like that. The door was open, Jenna, not unlocked. Open. There was a long pause on the other end. Maybe you forgot. Emily wanted to argue, but the truth was she couldn't be sure. The stress of the move, the constant exhaustion, it was possible, wasn't it? That night, she triple-checked every lock before climbing into bed. She even wedged a chair under the knob of the back door. At 3:07 a.m., the scraping sound came again. Only this time, it was right outside her bedroom door. Emily sat bolt upright, her hands gripping the blanket so tightly her knuckles hurt. The sound was slow, deliberate, like something hard dragging against the wooden floor. One scrape, pause, another scrape. Her phone was on the nightstand, but her hands shook too much to grab it. She stared at the thin line of light under the door, her chest rising and falling too quickly as she tried to stay silent. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. She didn't move until the sun started to lighten the edges of the curtains. The next morning, she found the chair by the back door pushed several feet across the kitchen floor. Emily didn't go to work that day. She sat in the living room with every light on, phone in hand, debating whether to call someone, police, a locksmith, anyone. But what would she even say? That her house was making noises? That she was scared of the dark? That evening, Jenna came over with 2 cups of coffee and that no-nonsense attitude Emily had always admired. They walked through the house together, room by room, checking every door and window, opening every closet, even peeking into the attic. Nothing. Jenna stayed until just after 10, joking about how Emily needed to lay off the horror movies, and for a while, Emily almost believed her. Until she went to bed. The scratching didn't wait until after midnight this time. It started as soon as she turned off the light, soft at first, like nails on the far wall, then louder, closer. Emily clutched her phone and turned the flashlight on, sweeping it across the room. The sound stopped instantly. The silence was so complete, it made her ears ring. She lowered the light slowly, and that's when she saw it, just for a second in the mirror above the vanity. A shadow, not her own, standing right behind her. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The following days blurred together in a haze of fear and exhaustion. She started leaving the TV on at night, the glow and background noise a small comfort in the oppressive quiet. But it didn't matter. The noises continued, sometimes soft scratching, sometimes the heavy thud of footsteps in the hall, and once the unmistakable sound of someone breathing just outside her bedroom door. On the 6th night, she woke to find every picture frame in the living room face down. She didn't even bother pretending anymore. She packed a bag before sunrise and drove to Jenna's apartment 2 towns over, shaking so hard she almost ran a red light. Jenna let her stay in the guest room, no questions asked. For the first time in days, Emily slept. But when she woke up the next morning, there was a long, fresh scratch down the side of her suitcase. And that was when she realized it wasn't the house, it was following her. Story the end. The first time I realized something was wrong was the night I forgot to lock my front door. It was late, close to midnight, and I'd just gotten home from work. My job at the diner ran me ragged most nights, and by the time I parked my car and dragged myself up the stairs to my little second-floor apartment, I barely had the energy to toss my keys in the bowl and collapse into bed. That night was no different, except I'd been too tired to do my usual routine of checking the deadbolt. I didn't think about it until much later. What I did think about as I lay there staring at the water stains on my ceiling was how quiet the building was. Normally, there was some kind of sound, someone arguing a floor down, a baby crying in the unit next to mine, the creak of pipes, or a TV buzzing faintly through the walls. But that night, the silence was deep. Oppressive, almost. I must have drifted off at some point, because the next thing I remember is the sound. It wasn't loud, more like the subtle shift of weight, something brushing lightly against the floorboards in the living room. I told myself it was probably the upstairs neighbor. He had this annoying habit of pacing late at night, but the sound wasn't coming from above me. It was inside my apartment. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, straining my ears to listen. It came again, the faint, deliberate sound of a foot dragging across the floor. For a moment, I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it, that my brain was just weaving scraps of noise into something that wasn't there. But then there was another sound, so soft I almost missed it. The quiet click of my front door latching shut. Every hair on my body stood on end. I sat up slowly, heart thudding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My phone was on the nightstand. I reached for it, keeping my eyes on the thin strip of light under my bedroom door. My fingers trembled as I unlocked it and hovered over the screen, debating between calling 911 or convincing myself this was some weird dream. Then the sound of movement came again. This time closer. Someone was in my apartment. I wanted to believe maybe it was a neighbor. Maybe someone had the wrong apartment and realized their mistake. But no. The steps were careful, quiet, purposeful. Whoever it was, they didn't want to wake me. I dialed 911 with shaking hands, pressed the phone to my ear, and prayed my voice wouldn't betray the fear curling in my chest. 911, what's your emergency? I kept my voice low. Someone's in my apartment. I don't know who they are. I'm in my bedroom. The door's closed. Stay on the line. Is your door locked? Yes, I whispered, though my eyes darted to the door, wondering if that flimsy little lock could actually keep anyone out. The operator kept talking, telling me to stay quiet, to stay put, that officers were on their way. I tried to focus on her voice instead of the creeping dread that filled the room. Every sound was amplified. The hum of my phone, the faint whir of the ceiling fan, the deliberate measured footsteps inching closer to my bedroom. And then, silence. I held my breath, staring at the bottom of the door, waiting to see the shadow of feet appear on the other side. Nothing. Not a sound, just that suffocating, unnatural stillness that made every second stretch out like an eternity. Ma'am, the operator whispered, stay calm. Officers are outside your building now. Can you get to your window? I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, my legs shaking as I slid off the bed. I kept the phone pressed to my ear with one hand and slowly eased the window open with the other. I could see the faint glow of flashing lights at the end of the block. And then I heard it, my bedroom door handle rattling. I froze, eyes wide, the phone slipping from my sweaty hand and clattering to the floor. The door didn't open, but whoever was on the other side was trying the handle. Slow, careful, testing. I scrambled through the window, my knees scraping against the sill, as I half fell onto the metal fire escape. The cold night air hit me like a slap, and I didn't stop moving until my feet hit the pavement and a uniformed officer was grabbing me by the shoulders, asking if I was hurt. They went up there. 4 officers, guns drawn, but they didn't find anyone. No sign of forced entry, no footprints, no fingerprints, nothing. But when I went back inside hours later, escorted by one of the officers, I saw it. A single muddy footprint in the corner of my bedroom. I changed the locks the next morning, paid extra for the heavy-duty deadbolt, the kind that would make the door impossible to open without tearing the frame apart. And for a while, that worked. I felt safer, or at least I told myself I did. But then the noises started again. At first, it was just little things. The faint scrape of something against the wall, a soft thump in the living room when I knew I'd left nothing out that could fall. I tried to rationalize it. Old buildings make noise, I told myself. Wood shifts, pipes rattle, neighbors bump against the walls. It's nothing. But then things started to move. I'd leave my keys in the bowl by the door and find them on the kitchen counter the next morning. My mail would be scattered across the table like someone had rifled through it. One night, I woke up to find my phone charger unplugged and coiled neatly on the nightstand. I told my friend Jenna about it over coffee one morning, trying to laugh it off. You probably just forget where you put stuff, she said, sipping her latte. I don't forget things like that, I said, a little sharper than I intended. I know what I'm talking about. She gave me that look, the one people give you when they're not sure if you're serious or losing it. Maybe you should get some cameras, she said finally, just to ease your mind. So I did. 2 little cameras from the hardware store, one in the living room, one in the kitchen. The first 2 nights, nothing. Just me coming and going, the empty stillness of the apartment while I slept or worked. Then, on the 3rd night, there was something. At 2:43 a.m., the camera in the living room picked up movement. I didn't see it at first. The footage was dark and grainy, the kind of low-resolution blur that makes everything look like static. But then I saw it, something tall moving past the edge of the frame, not quickly, slowly, like it knew it wasn't supposed to be seen. My stomach dropped. I went frame by frame, squinting at the shadows until I caught a glimpse of it. A man. Tall, thin, dressed in dark clothes, and he was barefoot. The police came again when I showed them the footage, but it was the same story as before. No sign of a break-in, no fingerprints, no footprints. They told me to stay somewhere else for a few nights, but I didn't have anywhere else to go. My family was states away, and I couldn't afford a hotel. So I stayed. I stopped sleeping through the night. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the building, every rustle of leaves outside my window had me sitting up in bed, clutching the baseball bat I kept beside me. And then one night, I woke up to the sound of breathing. It was soft, shallow. Right next to my bed, I didn't move, didn't even open my eyes. I just lay there frozen, my heart pounding so hard I was sure whoever or whatever was in the room could hear it. The breathing went on for what felt like forever. Then it stopped. When I finally opened my eyes, the room was empty, but the window was open. After that, I stopped trying to convince myself I was imagining things. I started locking the windows, double-checking the deadbolt, sleeping with every light in the apartment on. It didn't help. A week later, I came home to find a note on my pillow. It wasn't long, just 3 words, written in neat, almost childlike handwriting. I see you. I packed a bag that night and left. I didn't care where I ended up. I just knew I couldn't stay there another second. I never went back for my things. Sometimes, though, late at night, when the world is quiet and still, I swear I can hear that soft, steady breathing just inches from my ear. Story the end. It started with the kind of quiet that doesn't feel right, the kind that presses on your ears until you start to think something's wrong with your hearing. I had been living alone for almost a year in a small rental house on the edge of town, a 1-story place with cracked siding and a front porch that dipped just slightly to the left. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and the rent was low enough that I could afford it on my salary from the hardware store. Nights there were usually still. The neighborhood was quiet after dark. No dogs barking, no cars passing, just the occasional whistle of wind through the trees or the hum of a distant train. It was comforting in a way until that particular night when the silence turned heavy, thick, like something waiting. I was in bed, lying on my side with my phone dimly lighting the room when I heard it, a soft tapping like the quick tip of fingernails against glass. It came from the kitchen, I thought at first, but when I sat up and muted my phone, I realized it was from the back door. The house had an old wooden frame and a thin screen door that rattled with the slightest touch. This wasn't that. This was precise, intentional. I sat there for a minute, heart hammering, trying to convince myself it was just a branch or maybe the wind catching something loose. But I didn't have trees near the back, and the air was still. I got up slowly, telling myself I was overreacting. The old floorboards creaked under my bare feet as I walked through the hall, past the living room where the couch faced the dark television screen, to the kitchen that smelled faintly of the coffee I'd brewed earlier. I stood by the back door, my breath held, straining to hear. Tap, tap, tap. 3 deliberate knocks this time, slow and even, as if whoever or whatever was out there wanted me to know they were waiting. I didn't move for what felt like minutes. My pulse pounded in my ears. There was no porch light, just a stretch of black that my eyes couldn't adjust to. I told myself to look through the window above the sink, to just glance outside, but my feet wouldn't take me closer. Then it stopped. The quiet came back, deeper than before, and I stood there until my legs started to shake, half from fear, half from exhaustion. Eventually, I forced myself back to bed, convincing myself it had just been my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe a raccoon, maybe the wind. Anything but the thought of someone standing silently in the dark, waiting for me to open that door. The next morning, in the gray light of dawn, I almost laughed at myself. The fear felt silly in daylight. I checked the back porch before heading to work. No footprints, no signs of anything unusual, just the damp wood and a few dead leaves scattered by the wind. But the feeling didn't leave me. That night, double-checked the locks before bed. The kitchen door, the front door, even the tiny window in the bathroom that barely opened. I told myself I was just being careful. But at 2:13 a.m. I woke up again. This time, there was no tapping. There was whispering. I couldn't make out the words at first. It was like the sound you hear when you press a seashell to your ear, soft and far away, but definitely there. My stomach knotted, and I reached for my phone with a shaking hand, the screen lighting up the room with cold blue light. The whispering grew clearer, closer. It was coming from the hallway. I froze, staring at the cracked bedroom door, every muscle in my body tense. The sound didn't rise or fall. It stayed steady, low, but urgent, like someone having a hushed conversation right outside my room. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I sat there in the silence, clutching my phone like a lifeline, staring at the dark gap under the door, waiting to see a shadow pass by. Nothing did. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By the time the sun came up, my nerves were shot. I told myself I had to be imagining it. Lack of sleep, maybe some kind of auditory hallucination. I'd read about those online. People heard voices when they were stressed. That had to be it. But later that day, as I left for work, I noticed something I couldn't explain. On the back porch, right against the door, was a small pile of stones, smooth gray river stones stacked in a neat little pyramid. I didn't touch them. I didn't even breathe near them. By the time I came home that evening, they were gone. After that, it got worse. The tapping started again 2 nights later, only now it was faster, sharper, as though whoever was out there was growing impatient. Some nights it was at the back door, some nights the front. Once, terrifyingly, it came from the small window above the sink, the one no one could reach without a ladder. And always, always, it was followed by the whispers. I started sleeping with the lights on, a baseball bat by the side of my bed. I thought about calling the police more than once, but what would I even say? That I was hearing things? That someone was leaving stones on my porch? There was no proof, nothing they could act on. Then came the night when the whispers moved inside. I woke up at 3:07 a.m., drenched in sweat, and before I could even orient myself, I heard it, soft murmurs just beyond the bedroom door. I didn't move, I barely breathed, and then I heard the sound of my front door opening. The hinges on that door are loud, rusted. I knew that sound, and when it closed again slowly like someone was easing it shut, my entire body went cold. I wanted to call 911, but my phone was on the nightstand, and I couldn't make myself reach for it. I just lay there, eyes wide in the dark, listening to the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving through my house. They were slow, deliberate, not the heavy steps of someone trying to break in, but soft, careful steps, as though whoever was inside didn't want to wake me. They paused in the living room, then the hallway, then right outside my bedroom door. I clamped a hand over my mouth, my heart slamming so hard I thought it might give me away. The whispering started again, clearer this time. A voice, deep and rasping, so close it could have been right in my ear. I still couldn't make out the words, but it was speaking to me. I knew it. I don't know how long I lay there like that, frozen, waiting for the door to open, but it never did. At some point, maybe hours later, the sound faded, and when morning came, everything was quiet again. That was 3 weeks ago. I haven't slept through the night since. I started keeping a knife under my pillow, started checking every lock 3 times before bed, but none of it matters, because last night when I came home from work, there was something waiting for me on the front porch. Another stack of stones. This time there was a single word scratched into the top one, shallow but unmistakable. Wait. And as I stood there staring at it, the air around me went silent. No wind, no birds, nothing. Just the soft, almost imperceptible sound of someone breathing, close enough that I should have felt it on my neck. Story the end.